Thank you, Governor Mills. It's a great warm-up act for the historian of the Electoral College. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Honorable Jim Tierney. Welcome to this historic moment. In a few minutes, we will watch Maine's 4 electors ratify the voting decisions made by more than 820,000 of our fellow citizens. All of our votes were counted here in Maine. The results certified by the Secretary of State, and they represent who it is that we, as a state, believe should be our president. Article 2 of the United States Constitution and Maine law requires our electors to follow these certified votes. 2 electors will vote for the candidate who received the most votes statewide, and 2 electors will vote for the candidate who carried their congressional district. There is no suspense in who these electors will vote for. And at this very moment, this process is being followed all across our country. All of us, together, have fulfilled our constitutional task. We've done our duty, and with a record turnout, congratulations to all of us. How did this come to pass? In 1776, we'd broken the ties that had bound us to Great Britain with a ringing Declaration of Independence that promised all men are created equal, and we'd fought a bloody war. But our leaders still soon learned that the Articles of Confederation did not provide to us the central government that we needed to survive as a nation. And so 10 years later, in the hot summer of 1787, each state sent an all-male delegation to Philadelphia. All told, there were about 50 delegates. And they reflected the values of the day as they sat and tried to figure out what to do. Most worked hard. They came every day. They argued, they broke into factions, and they regrouped. And because they were pledged to secrecy, they pretty much could only talk to each other. There were no phones, no emails, no Instagrams. No way to keep track of the rest of their lives, their families, their farms, their businesses. They stayed there until they figured it out. Now, they were state leaders, but they were hardly the saints or seers as some historians and some judges now make them out to be. They reflected the values of their day, and so many of them owned slaves. They had to do it without 2 of their best thinkers. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were not in Philadelphia because they were in Europe representing our country as ambassadors. The task was to craft a document, a piece of paper really, that would be somehow very hard to change and yet would govern a nation forever. And they knew from the very beginning that no one would leave Philadelphia completely satisfied. It is no easy task to write a constitution. The delegates soon found they were bound together by 2 seemingly diametrically opposed principles. The first was the need to form a stronger central federal government. But the second was to constitutionalize America's aversion to a concentration of governmental power. That's what the Revolutionary War, of course, was all about. They wanted government power diffused. And so what they produced was not a particularly egalitarian document. The Supreme Court is not egalitarian. The provisions that made it possible for human beings to be bought and sold as property was not egalitarian, and a great shame from which we still are reeling as a country. That women could not vote was incomprehensible. And the United States Senate was and still is a wildly unrepresentative institution if you're looking at them to represent the majority of the views of the American people. They left to the very end to figure out how to choose a president. I've read a lot about this, and it's clear to me that they didn't know what to do. They knew what they didn't want. They didn't want a president who was a member of Congress. They didn't want to have a prime minister. And they did not want someone elected directly by the entire country because of their fear of a potential dictator, a demagogue, who would undo what had been accomplished during the Revolutionary War. So they designed this process that we are following today, even though they knew it had serious problems. Alexander Hamilton from New York was a delegate to that convention, as well as a future Broadway star. And he was the Electoral College's most ardent defender. And yet even he wrote, "If the matter of it be not perfect, it is at least excellent." James Madison, another delegate, who would be our fourth president, was more realistic. He said Article 2 had the fewest disadvantages. Thomas Jefferson, who became a master of manipulating the Electoral College, he ran for president 3 times, would refer to it later as the most dangerous blot in our constitutional system. Be that as it may, the system that the delegates divides, only amended once by the 12th Amendment, continues, and we follow it today and probably forever. In the short term, and as politicians, they were primarily concerned about the short term. They weren't particularly worried. George Washington was going to be the first president. He was sitting right there with him every day. He was 6'4". He was a natural leader. He was a hero. And because he owned 200 slaves, he was acceptable to the South. So they all went home, leaving us with this state-based system where electors are not allowed to use their own judgment. As one Federalist leader said of a faithless elector in 1800, "I chose him to act, not to think." In the end, it was the preferences of states that mattered. Then as now, it was not a popular vote. We would be then and forever the United States of America. This selection process has always been a scary proposition. A time bomb lodged near the heart of our nation. According to James Michener, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and an elector from Pennsylvania before he moved to Brunswick. A time bomb lodged near the heart of the nation. I want to talk a little bit about our second president, John Adams. Long before he was president, Adams was a young trial lawyer, newly married, and living in Boston, which some of us may know is a city in Massachusetts, which we also know was for a time a part of Maine, before we so wisely left it adrift to do the best it could on its own. To make a living, Adams rode the legal circuit and tried many cases. He took anything, as young lawyers did, anything came in to do it. Defending criminals, doing divorces, boundary disputes, he did them all. And he came to Maine to the Pownellborough Courthouse, just a few miles from where we are here, on the Kennebec River in the town of Dresden. He evidently didn't know about mud season in Maine. He made the mistake of coming to Dresden from Portland by horse instead of coming by boat. He later wrote that he traveled through an entire wilderness encumbered with the greatest number of trees of the largest size and the tallest height that I have ever seen. He was in constant fear his horse would break a leg and he would have to walk. Well, Adams won his case, but he never came back to Dresden. By the way, this courthouse is one of my favorite places in Maine, and I urge you to go. And if you do, don't miss the small cemetery, which is up a dirt path behind it. There you will find the grave of Lieutenant Charles Goodwin, who at the age of 25 was killed in the Battle of Antietam, fighting for the Union in September of 1862. If you visit, you cannot help but be moved. Adams continued to come to Maine. His last visit occurred in the summer of 1774. He came with his best friend, Jonathan Sewell, who was then the Attorney General of Massachusetts, had been appointed by the royal government. They'd been college classmates at the school where I now teach. On a July morning, Sewell and Adams climbed up Mungery Hill in Portland, where they sat and both of them remembered talked for hours overlooking Casco Bay. Sewell was a Tory. He begged Adams to give up the Patriot cause. He offered him a badly needed job. Adams had 4 children, was having trouble making ends meet. And he told Adams that if there was war, England would win, and that he, Adams, would be found guilty of treason and hanged. But Adams did not change. The die was now cast, he wrote. I had passed the Rubicon, sink or swim, live or die, survive or perish for my country. That was my unalterable determination. Their personal parting was painful, and as Adams wrote, this adieu is the sharpest thorn upon which I ever put my foot. Sewell fled to England, and 29-year-old John Adams went on to serve in the First Continental Congress. When he got there, he sat in the same rooms with young Thomas Jefferson under the watchful eye of the aging Benjamin Franklin, and they drafted and redrafted, line by line, the Declaration of Independence. As Jefferson wrote, there was no better man than John Adams. And further, he wrote that Adams did not quietly support the Declaration, but he fought fearlessly for every word. That was in 1776. In 1784, Adams and Jefferson found themselves in Paris, where they worked together every day to negotiate an end to the Revolutionary War. And then in 1887, they were together in London to help negotiate badly needed commercial treaties, which is why they weren't in Philadelphia. Abigail Adams had joined her husband with their youngest children in London, and the widow Jefferson had brought over his children, who were then mothered by Abigail Adams. These two men could not have been closer. They held family secrets in complete confidence. In 1796, John Adams was elected our second president, defeating his then friend Thomas Jefferson, but by a scant 3 electoral votes. That made Jefferson vice president. But then the differences grew, and they soon led to a bitter split. There are many reasons for the split, too many to recount, but at core, Jefferson was a man of the South who owned slaves and opposed a strong federal government, and John Adams was the opposite. So in 1800, they ran against each other. This time, there was no friendship. Long abandoned intellectual principles about the Electoral College were abandoned. Both fought to win. It was bare-knuckle politics. Adams wrote then of his now former friend Thomas Jefferson that I know he has integrity, but his mind is now poisoned with passion and prejudice and faction. He is as ambitious as Oliver Cromwell. It was the bitterest of campaigns, rivaling the ones that we just experienced. And when it was over, Adams lost. Oh, he was angry. He was angry. He believed it was stolen. He believed there was fraud. He believed money had changed hands. He felt personally betrayed. And in his anger, he worked right up to the last night he was president. He was the first resident of the White House, a building built by slaves. And he worked to the last night appointing judges, right up to the last minute. And yet at 4 a.m. on Wednesday, March 4th, 1801, the now 65-year-old John Adams, no longer the young lawyer in Dresden, walked out of the White House for the last time. He turned and looked back, saw it illuminated by candlelight from the inside, and under a clear, cold sky and a quarter moon. He left. He stepped into a public stagecoach, and he left. He certainly was not going to Jefferson's inauguration. Very good chance he wasn't invited. But he left. He was still commander-in-chief, right? He was president. He could have ordered the militia out in those last months. He could have tried to interfere with Jefferson's inauguration. But in fact, that never occurred to him, because we had a constitution. And that day, for the first time in the history of the world, government power had been peaceably passed because of an election. Government power had been peaceably passed because of an election. So this is the Electoral College we follow today. Even as we disparage its very existence, we follow its rules. In doing so, we keep faith with the 160 million Americans who voted this year, a record turnout, something of which we should be so proud. And we honor a constitutional structure that gave us 2 Roosevelts and Abraham Lincoln. And they gave us both Adams and Jefferson, whose personal animosity is long forgotten, as they remain among the most admired of our founding citizens. So today, regardless of our choice for president, we should all rejoice in this right we had to engage in this collective decision. Of course, half of us are usually elated, and the other half are bitterly disappointed, just as John Adams was bitterly disappointed 220 years ago. But Adams kept going, the country kept going, and so shall we. We may feel like we're in crisis, but we've faced more serious challenges. There are some of these pundits now, on radio, on television, who talk about succession. They talk about violence will erupt in the next month. That's not going to happen. It just won't. And by the way, if you want to know about election violence, let me take a slight detour. One of the greatest chances we ever had of election violence occurred right here in this building. Right here in this building. In 1879, we had a governor, apparently defeated. He began a closed-door recount of the votes, and all of a sudden, it looked like he might pull it out and keep his job for another year. Huge rallies broke out across Maine, in every town, and afraid for his safety and that of his government, on Christmas morning in 1879, the governor ordered armaments to be sent from Bangor to Augusta. But a mob blocked the transfer at the Kenduskeag Stream. Trying again, the armaments arrived here, right here, on December 30th, and the governor immediately used them to arm a paramilitary force that occupied every room on the second and third floor of this building. He had guards with guns and bayonets in every window. He placed snipers on the rotunda. And he had opposition. The governor's opponents were led by U.S. Senator James Blaine, who left his mansion in Washington on DuPont Circle and came racing back to his mansion here in Augusta. He arrived and he illegally ordered 300 armed Civil War veterans to march from Bath to Augusta and to drill on the lawn of his home, which is now, of course, our governor's mansion. This story captivated America and the country's imagination. It appeared in every national newspaper under banner headlines predicting civil war in Maine. Thousands of voters on both sides held rallies and threatened violence, not dissimilar to what is going on today. And then the governor did two things. The first thing he did was to ask the Maine Supreme Judicial Court for an advisory ruling as to who really won the election. In other words, he turned to the courts and asked for a ruling of law. The second thing the governor did was to call on Civil War hero and former Governor Joshua Chamberlain to come to this building, our State House, and establish martial law. Chamberlain arrived on January 7th, 1880. He cleared the building of the paramilitaries in about 45 minutes. He refused Blaine's request to activate the militia. He sent the munitions back to Bangor. He sent the 300 Blaine-ordered soldiers back to Bath. He stared down an armed mob that threatened to kill him, and he stopped a sheriff who tried to arrest him. And soon there was a Gatling gun in what is now the Hall of Flags. And significantly, and maybe the most significant, he turned down offers from both political parties for a seat in the United States Senate, a job he wanted and had dreamed of. Senators then were selected by the legislature. He turned down that job because he felt it was a bribe, an attempt to subvert the rule of law. Chamberlain waited 12 long days in this building. He never left. He took careful notes. He would not depart from his conviction that it would be the law and the court, not threats and intimidation and bribes, that would prevail. And when the court decision came down, the governor lost, and he went back to Lewiston. The new governor came down from Corinth, and Joshua Chamberlain went home to Brunswick, having kept peace by adhering to the letter of the Constitution and the law. And in showing this commitment, he ended his own political life. Chamberlain would never again serve in a public role. But late in his life, he called his work on that cold January of 1880 by far the greatest public service I ever rendered. Think of this. The greatest public service was not the courage he showed at Gettysburg, when he fought those who were treasonous, who wanted to destroy our Union, to promote slavery. That was not his greatest service. His greatest public service was his adherence to the rule of law. He knew all about violence. He'd been wounded 6 times. He knew what violence meant for this country. It was the rule of law, his greatest public servant. And now, 140 years later, it's Joshua Chamberlain who lives in our state's history as the most honored citizen. No one remembers his government. So in times of stress like these, like now, like Adams, like Chamberlain, it is our government institutions that hold. I believe this is true because we as Americans cherish the rule of law. I believe that at our core we still cherish each other. And we adhere to our Constitution because no matter how flawed and unfair and outdated it might sometimes seem to be, it is what brings us together. See, our Constitution is no longer just a document. It's a way of believing. It's a way of living. It's a structure that allows men and women to rise up in personal safety without fear to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. If our Constitution is in our hearts, and while it lives there, our union will continue. Let me close with the words of another son of Maine, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was born in Portland in 1807. His grandfather and his father were not only members of Congress, but just like the 4 of you, they were presidential electors. But Henry was not a governor, general, or a lawyer, a politician. He was a poet. He was also an abolitionist and a patriot who found the words then that resonated then and resonate now. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging, breathless, on its fate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim Tierney, for that stirring history of the Electoral College. The Sergeant at Arms will escort the Governor of the state of Maine from the Electoral College.